In 605 BC, the holy city of Jerusalem, the jewel of the kingdom of Judah, sank into a sea of fire. The night sky shattered beneath the crimson-orange glow of destruction. The Babylonian armies surged in ruthlessly, their horses' iron-shod hooves trampling the sacred Torah scrolls scattered across the cobblestone streets. Dust and ash swirled through the air, marking the unstoppable fall of a kingdom. By dawn, in the temple courtyard, the surviving people of Judah were herded into clusters, coated in falling ash like snow. Amidst the wailing of women and the despairing collapse of men, Daniel, a 16-year-old boy with finely etched features, knelt quietly on one knee. Shedding not a single tear, his chest rose and fell with an unnervingly calm rhythm against the suffocating atmosphere. When the Babylonian general Nebuzaradan appeared with the imposing aura of a conqueror, his sharp, cold gaze swept over the prisoners before suddenly halting. He locked eyes with Daniel. Amidst thousands who cowered and bowed their heads, the young boy held his head high. It was not the reckless insolence of youth, but a chilling stillness, a pride rooted deep in a faith that the fires of Babylon could not consume. Deeply struck by this, Nebuzaradan ordered a heavy, freezing iron yoke clasped around Daniel's neck. Yet the boy's gaze never once wavered. The agonizing march began. Beneath the blazing, unforgiving sun of the Syrian desert, thousands of chained Judean captives dragged their feet across the burning sand like a giant, despairing serpent. The weak who fell were left to the vultures. Suddenly, an exhausted 8-year-old boy collapsed right in front of Daniel, narrowly escaping a beating from a guard who had raised his spear. Without hesitation, Daniel stepped forward, using his own shoulder as a shield. With a piercing glare and unflinching resolve, he forced the soldier to mutter a curse and walk away. Daniel knelt beside the child. With trembling hands, he opened the goatskin pouch at his hip, yielding his last 3 most precious drops of water to the boy. The child swallowed them greedily. Life slowly crept back into his eyes as he looked up at Daniel with profound gratitude. That act of sacrifice ignited a blazing torch of hope in the despairing eyes of his fellow captives. Without a single rallying cry, the essence of a young leader had taken root in the most unforgiving place on earth. Daniel's silhouette stood tall and unyielding as he supported the boy, pressing onward through the vast, cruel expanse of the desert. After 60 days of dragging their feet across the desert of death, the kingdom of Judah was nothing but an ash-filled memory. The final gateway leading into the center of the world emerged, suffocating anyone with a faint heart. The colossal Ishtar Gate soared into the heavens, covered by tens of thousands of breathtaking lapis lazuli glazed bricks. Under the harsh sun, the walls shimmered like a magical illusion. Along the passage were gold-inlaid reliefs carved with images of the Marduk dragon and the sacred Aurochs bull. They bared their fangs and glared down at the ragged, trembling prisoners marching past. The pungent scent of eastern spices mingled with the smell of blood and slave sweat, creating a suffocating yet mesmerizing atmosphere. Babylon did not merely defeat its enemies with swords and spears, it crushed their pride with sheer extravagance. Inside the Winter Palace, the most exceptional children of Judean royalty were separated from their families. Daniel and his 3 close friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were stripped of their familiar, rough garments, replaced by the soft silks and ornate jewelry of the Chaldeans. Their sunburned skin was massaged with fragrant oils, as if preparing the most precious commodities for an exhibition. Yet the true torture lay not in the flesh, but in the soul. At the Royal Academy, under the cold supervision of the chief eunuch Ashpenaz, the brainwashing process began. With an ironclad decree, Ashpenaz stripped away their names that bore the meaning of honoring their god. Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, Azariah was changed to Abednego, and Daniel, whose name meant, God is my judge, was forced to take the name Belteshazzar, implying a plea for protection from the pagan god Bel. Choked sobs broke out in the night from children robbed of their identities, but Daniel maintained a terrifying stillness, using his unwavering gaze as an anchor for his brothers. The climax of this uncompromising war took place in the grand dining hall. A regal feast was laid out: succulent roasted lamb, golden brown roasted quails, exotic fruits, and jugs of bubbling crimson wine. Behind the banquet table stood a colossal golden statue of the god Marduk, shrouded in thick incense smoke. This food had been sacrificed to pagan gods, an ultimate defilement according to Hebrew law. While other youths from defeated nations rushed in to devour the meal and soothe their days-long hunger, Daniel's group of 4 sat motionless. Their hands were tightly clenched, hidden beneath the table. That silent defiance immediately caught the attention of Ashpenaz. He stepped forward, his dark shadow casting over the 4 children's table, threatening that their frailty would provoke the wrath of King Nebuchadnezzar and cause his own head to fall. It was then that Daniel stood up. He did so not with the insolence of a loud martyr, but with the calm, wise demeanor of a born diplomat. He looked straight at Ashpenaz and made a daring proposal: a 10-day test. They would consume only vegetables, grains, and plain water. If, after 10 days, their appearance was more withered than those who ate the king's provisions, they would submit to any punishment. Overwhelmed by Daniel's strange confidence and aura, Ashpenaz reluctantly agreed. The Babylonian night never slept. The sound of lyres, the pounding of drums, and the echoes of revelry from the ziggurat temples reverberated all the way to the stars. Standing on the freezing marble balcony of the palace, Daniel cast his gaze down at the blazing monster below. He slowly knelt, clasped his hands together, and shut his eyes tightly. A prayer in Hebrew rose silently, yet resonated powerfully within his mind. Amidst an empire that worshipped hundreds of dazzling and violent gods, the faith of a solitary youth became the purest and most immortal light of all. The Babylonian Empire was at its most brilliant golden age, extending its tentacles to swallow the ancient world whole. Yet the one holding the power of life and death over millions of souls, King Nebuchadnezzar the Great, was imprisoned within his own mind. The long nights in the Winter Palace became brutal torture sessions. Nebuchadnezzar was constantly suffocated by a recurring nightmare of the apocalypse. Upon waking, his royal robes were drenched in sweat, and his heart raced erratically, but the memory of the dream vanished, leaving only an invisible terror gnawing at his soul. The proud king, who had never tasted defeat on the battlefield, now trembled before a supernatural force he could not touch. This helplessness quickly morphed into a tyrant's madness. Nebuchadnezzar summoned all the supreme magicians, sorcerers, and astrologers of Babylon to the royal court. He issued an impossible demand. They not only had to interpret the dream, but they also had to tell him exactly what he had dreamed. When the most brilliant minds of the empire bowed down on the cold marble floor, confessing human impotence before the divine, Nebuchadnezzar's wrath erupted like a volcano. A bloody decree was issued: the massacre of all the wise men in the kingdom. The scythe of death was swiftly raised. Arioch, the captain of the royal guard, brought his blood-stained sword to knock on the door of Daniel and his 3 friends. Facing imminent death, Daniel did not panic or weep. With extraordinary calmness and innate diplomatic skill, he persuaded Arioch to delay the execution, while risking his life to request an audience with the king to ask for one more night of grace. That night, in their dark, confined quarters, the 4 Judean youths did not use incantations, nor did they gut animals to read omens like the Chaldeans. They knelt, clasped their hands together, and created an absolute stillness to connect with the Most High. And then the space around Daniel blurred. He fell into a night vision, his mind drawn straight into the very ruins of the Babylonian king's dream. Daniel witnessed an overwhelming and terrifying scene. Amidst the gloomy void, a colossal statue in the shape of a man loomed overhead. Its head was cast of dazzling pure gold, its chest and arms of cold silver, its belly and thighs of glowing bronze, its legs of rigid dark iron, and its feet were a frail, grotesque mixture of iron and miry clay. The stillness of the statue radiated a suffocating pressure, representing the most brutal empires in history. Suddenly, from an invisible mountain, a rough stone, not cut by human hands, soared forward like a shooting star. It struck a devastating blow to the feet of clay. An explosion shook the space. The entire colossal statue collapsed, the metals shattered, disintegrating into billions of tiny suspended dust particles before being swept away by a whirlwind, leaving not a single trace. Conversely, the stone shuddered, growing infinitely larger until it became a massive mountain that covered the whole earth. The next morning, the royal court was as silent as the grave. Daniel stood before Nebuchadnezzar's throne. He unveiled the king's deepest secret, describing every detail of the statue and the fateful collision. He deciphered that this was the flow of history. Babylon was the head of gold, but it would be replaced by lesser empires of silver, bronze, and iron until all were crushed by the eternal kingdom of God. Upon hearing this, Nebuchadnezzar's pupils dilated, and his breath hitched. The supernatural truth had shattered the tyrant's shell of arrogance. To the astonishment of hundreds of civil and military officials, Nebuchadnezzar stepped down from his grand throne, fell to his knees, and prostrated himself at the feet of a slave boy. The massacre decree was instantly revoked. Daniel was appointed ruler over the entire province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men. Yet amidst the dazzling glory and supreme power, Daniel's silhouette retained its humility. He used his first privilege not to enrich himself, but to appoint his 3 friends to vital positions, beginning the mission of protecting the vulnerable, enslaved souls groaning at the bottom of the empire. The rapid ascension of Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, at the Babylonian court, sowed the utmost jealousy in the hearts of the native officials. The cowardly Chaldeans, terrified by the influence of their singular faith, conspired to use the king's own pride as a weapon. They instigated King Nebuchadnezzar to cast a colossal statue of pure gold, towering 30 meters high, standing imposing amidst the plain. The king, blinded by mortal glory, issued a brutal decree. Anyone who did not bow down before the statue when the sound of musical instruments rang out would be immediately thrown into a blazing, roaring furnace. On the day of the ceremony, thousands fell to their knees, but the 3 Judean friends stood tall, as silent as mountains, against the pressure of an entire empire. This action was nothing less than a public death sentence. Thousands of Babylonian citizens and officials gathered around the furnace, creating an overwhelming grand furnace scene. The setting was fraught with peril. The sound was no longer the joyous noise of musical instruments, but the screaming, roaring fire, like a starving monster drowning out all other clamor. Nebuchadnezzar, in a frenzy of perceived insult, ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. Arioch, with a heavy expression, herded the 3 tightly bound friends to the mouth of the furnace. The cruel heat of the blazing fire scorched the air, melting sweat and cracking the earth. The 3 friends stepped forward, their eyes not on the flames, but turned toward Jerusalem. As the aggressive guards attempted to throw them in, a tragedy unfolded. Merely touching the horrific heat, the robust Babylonian soldiers were instantly incinerated by the extreme temperature. Their bodies erupted into living torches and collapsed before the terrified screams of the crowd. The 3 Judean friends fell into the heart of the furnace. Nebuchadnezzar, sitting on his throne observing from afar, squinted against the heat, anticipating a shattering death. But instead, sheer astonishment washed over his face. He stood up abruptly, stepped back and rubbed his eyes, unable to believe what he was seeing. He called out loudly, "Did I not cast 3 tightly bound men into the furnace? But look, I see 4 men unbound, leisurely strolling amidst the flames without a single wound." At this moment, a miracle appeared. Amidst billions of particle VFX embers, the silhouettes of the 3 friends emerged clearly. But beside them, there was a 4th figure. This figure did not bear a mortal form, but was a supernatural being of majestic and boundlessly pure beauty. The light radiating from that entity overpowered the crimson-orange fire of Babylon, creating a pure, cool aura. The 3 friends walked calmly and serenely beside that being, as if the hellfire were nothing but a gentle breeze. Nebuchadnezzar was no longer the tyrant, but a man utterly subdued before the power of a true god. Years passed since the miracle in the fiery furnace, and Babylon was now not merely an empire, but a marvel of the ancient world. King Nebuchadnezzar had reached the absolute zenith of fame and power. That afternoon, while strolling on the roof of the Winter Palace, he cast his gaze over the endlessly sprawling city. Lush green hanging gardens suspended in mid-air, glazed lapis lazuli city walls glowing under the sunset, and tens of thousands of slaves bowing before his throne. Arrogance, like a sweet poison, seeped into the tyrant's veins. Ignoring all of Daniel's previous warnings, he spread his arms wide, took a deep breath, and uttered a fateful blasphemy. "Is this not the great Babylon that I have built by my mighty power to honor my own majesty?" The words had barely faded before the sky, not yet darkened into night, suddenly fell terrifyingly silent. An invisible voice, echoing not from the clouds but striking directly into Nebuchadnezzar's very marrow, delivered the verdict. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom has departed from you." At that exact moment, the mind of the world's greatest king completely collapsed. There were no swords, no mutinies. What was stripped away was his sanity. His pupils constricted, and the sharp gaze of a god of war vanished, giving way to the bewilderment, panic, and wildness of a feral beast. He collapsed onto the marble floor, his limbs contorted, his mouth growling meaningless sounds. The officials and courtiers rushed forward in horror, but their king was no longer there. Only a maddened creature remained, baring its teeth and snapping at anyone who touched it. The days that followed were a tragedy hidden from the populace, depicted through a dark and haunting visual montage. Nebuchadnezzar, who once wore the finest silks and brocades, was stripped of all dignity. He was driven from the royal palace and banished into the wild fields. The king, who had once dined on exquisite delicacies, now knelt on the muddy ground, using his teeth to uproot dew-drenched grass, devouring it alongside the cattle. The hair that was once anointed with fragrant oils was now matted, growing long and ragged like the feathers of an eagle. The fingernails that had once gripped a scepter grew long, crooked and grimy like the claws of a bird. His skin cracked, exposed to the blistering desert sun and the bone-chilling, freezing rains. The image of the world's most powerful king, naked and trembling, crawling on all fours beneath a thunderstorm, served as a brutal visual verdict on the fragility of mortal life. All human power, wealth, and pride are but a fragile shell, capable of being stripped away in the blink of an eye before the infinite power of the Creator. As the morning light dispelled the cold desert mist, King Darius's choked, despairing call echoed down to the bottom of the deep pit. And then, from the realm of death, a calm, resonant voice rang out, shattering all the Persian king's doubts. Daniel declared that God had sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths, for he was found completely innocent before him and also before the king. Tears burst forth on the face of the warrior King Darius. He immediately ordered his soldiers to lower ropes and pull his old friend up from the mouth of the deadly den. When Daniel's bare feet touched the ground once more, dozens of guards and officials gasped in astonishment. Under the brilliant sunlight, they scrutinized every inch of his flesh, every fold of his robes. Miraculously, there was not a single scratch, not a drop of blood, not even a frayed thread. The stench of death from the lion's den did not cling to him at all. The power of such immense protection was enough to make all mortal authority bow their heads in terror. But Persian law always demanded a blood reckoning, and King Darius's wrath now poured down upon those who had dared to manipulate the royal power to satisfy their cowardly jealousy. The king, who was merciful to Daniel that morning, now transformed into an unforgiving tyrant. He ordered the arrest of all the satraps and prefects who had plotted to frame Daniel. No trial was held. The sentence was carried out instantly. The officials, who had once swaggered in their noble silk garments, now cried out pitifully, kneeling and begging at Darius's feet. But the king's eyes were as cold as ice. They were dragged to the mouth of the den. The stone was cast aside. The masterminds were shoved into the deep pit. And a horrifying scene, completely contrasting with the stillness of the previous night, unfolded. The lions, as docile as house cats at Daniel's feet, now awakened their most brutal, savage instincts. Before the plummeting bodies of the officials could even hit the bottom of the den, the ferocious beasts lunged upward from the shadows. The deafening crunch of breaking bones, the sound of tearing flesh, and agonizing screams echoed through a corner of the royal palace, proving a chilling truth. The miracle of the previous night did not occur because the beasts were satiated, but because they were suppressed by a supreme supernatural power. That monumental event completely altered the history of the empire. From his throne, King Darius personally wrote a new decree, sealed it with the royal signet, and dispatched thousands of cavalrymen to deliver it with utmost speed to every province and every nation across the entire kingdom. The decree did not compel people to worship the Persian gods, but required the entire empire to revere the God of Daniel, the living God, the Savior who performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. That afternoon, the Persian palace returned to its inherent majestic tranquility. Daniel, the elder statesman who had lived through 3 kings and the fall of 2 empires, slowly walked back to his private chambers. He gently pushed open the familiar wooden window. The evening breeze tossed his pure white hair. Daniel knelt once more, clasped his hands together, and turned his eyes toward distant Jerusalem. His silhouette dissolved into the brilliant sunset, closing a magnificent chapter of immortal faith and ushering in a new era of peace for the exiles. Daniel had now reached the final years of his life. The octogenarian who had witnessed the rise and fall of the world's greatest empires stood alone on the banks of the Tigris River. The swirling river waters carried the dusky haze of history. But the moment he knelt to pray, the physical timeline abruptly snapped. The silent sky above the Tigris shattered like a giant pane of glass, revealing a brilliant and terrifying gate of time. Daniel's mind was sucked straight into another dimension, where the flow of humanity was no longer measured in years, but in blood, iron, and fire. The vision opened with a pitch-black ocean, churning fiercely under the force of the 4 winds of heaven. From the bottom of the abyss of chaos, 4 colossal, grotesque beasts representing mortal empires emerged one after another, obscuring the sky. First was a majestic lion with eagle wings, Babylon. But then its wings were plucked off. It was forced to stand on 2 feet like a human and given a weak heart. Next, the water's surface split in 2, and a giant bear, Medo-Persia, arose, raised up on one of its sides, clutching 3 bleeding ribs in its mouth, growling to devour more flesh. Immediately following was a leopard, Greece, darting past with terrifying speed, bearing 4 bird wings and 4 heads on its back, symbolizing a lightning-fast conquering empire that was quickly torn apart. And finally, true darkness enveloped as the fourth beast appeared, a monster unlike any creature on Earth. It had no name, only absolute brutality. Its colossal iron teeth crushed everything. 10 sharp horns rose from its head, and a little horn sprouted in the middle, possessing eyes like human eyes and a mouth speaking arrogant, insolent words, defying heaven itself. That monster trampled the earth, bringing a dark age that seemed never to end. But exactly at the moment despair reached its peak, heavenly judgment descended. The pitch-black sky above the ocean of monsters was torn open by a pure light, more blinding than thousands of suns. The Ancient of Days appeared, seated on a fiery throne with blazing wheels of fire. His hair was as white as snow, his garment as pure as light. A river of fire flowed out from before him, and millions upon millions of angels stood in attendance. Before that absolute authority, the fourth beast was destroyed in the blink of an eye, its corpse thrown into the eternal flame. And then, upon the clouds of heaven, the Son of Man came, approaching the Ancient of Days. He was given an everlasting kingdom that would never be shaken or pass away. The vision closed, returning Daniel to reality. He collapsed on the banks of the Tigris River, his forehead drenched in sweat, his whole body trembling from exhaustion before the power of the vision. In the soft light of dawn, the angel Gabriel, an entity of breathtaking majesty and boundless peace, appeared. Placing a radiant hand on the elder statesman's shoulder, Gabriel spoke in a warm, deep voice. "Go your way, Daniel, for these words are sealed up until the time of the end. Rest, and you will stand in your allotted place at the end of the days." Daniel smiled, his wrinkled eyes closing in profound contentment. He had fulfilled his mission. The frame gradually pulled back from his small silhouette on the banks of the Tigris. The camera ascended above the layers of clouds, looking down at the turning earth. The timeline accelerated to maximum speed. Ancient ruins were buried. Medieval castles rose and fell. Industrial revolutions spewed smoke into the high sky, until the brilliant urban light networks of the modern world, the year 2026, illuminated the entire globe. The kingdoms of men were still passing by, but the eternal prophecy was still awaiting its final day of fulfillment.